Welcome to our first business breakfast in the School of Advertising, Marketing and Public Relations for the year. We are really delighted with our panel this morning. It's talking about leading different insights from advertising leaders in Australia, the US and the UK. I'm Dr. Edwina Luck and I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then at the end of the webinar, there'll be time for questions, so you can either write those in the chat box during the presentation, or you can unmute yourself at the end and ask questions to the panel. But before we start, I'd just like to welcome you to QUT and acknowledge the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Yugara peoples, as First Nation owners of the lands where QUT stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creative spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been the places of teaching, research and learning. QUT also acknowledges the very important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. So first of all, I'd like to welcome our wonderful panel, Professor Gail Kerr. Gail's passion for advertising began as a copywriter working in the industry for more than a decade. She now shares her love of advertising as professor in the School of Advertising, Marketing and PR, teaching advertising, digital media and IMC, and conducting academic and commercial research. Gail has published over 80 peer-reviewed articles and conference papers and presented her research at advertising industry conferences such as the Marketing Science Ideas Exchange last year. Then we have Dr. Louise Kelly, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Advertising, Marketing and Public Relations. And for over a decade, Louise has been teaching and researching in the areas of advertising, digital marketing, charitable donor motivations, millennials' online behaviour, social media and privacy, and more recently, leadership in advertising. She holds a PhD from QUT and has published her research as well in international and leading journals such as the Journal of Advertising, Journal of Consumer Affairs, and the Journal of Marketing Communications. Lee Terry is the Asia Pacific CEO of IPG Media Brands. He has spent more than 20 years working in media, beginning his career at OMD in the UK before moving to Australia, where he became Managing Director. Lee then went on to run Omnicom in Australia and New Zealand before taking the opportunity to lead IPG Media Brands across the Asia Pacific. Lee also has written and authored cases for both Australian and American advertising textbooks, and he is a frequent guest speaker and strong supporter of QUT. We welcome our panel and we welcome you as well to enjoy the next 45 minutes with our fabulous guests. Over to you, Gail.
Thanks, Edwina, and thanks to our co-author, thanks to our co-author, Padmini, who's joining us all the way from South Carolina for a very late breakfast. I think it's 5:30 in the afternoon over there. And here's to the rest of us, the crazy ones who got up early for this business breakfast, the rebels and the troublemakers whose wonderful creativity inspires our students and whose thinking changes our world. And while advertising might have encouraged us all to think different, do advertising people also lead different? Well, that's what we wanted to find out. So we took a universal theory, Globe's culturally endorsed leadership theory, and applied it to advertising. In particular, we wanted to explore whether advertising leadership in global contexts has some elements that are universally endorsed and others that are culturally contingent. And then how do these leadership attributes and styles vary across Australia, the US, and the UK? Now, this is important because things are changing, especially in advertising. All over the world, agencies are confronted by similar institutional and environmental pressures, driven by innovation, technology, and data. They need to extend core competencies beyond advertising. They've got to manage fluid internal environments with in-house project teams, routinely made up of many different skill sets and many very different types of people. And with multiple industries competing for these converging skills, competition is no longer restricted to other advertising agencies. So effective leadership is central to negotiating this change. It must successfully stimulate creativity in new and different ways and help agencies adapt and attract, manage and retain a diverse cross-functional workforce. Here, advertising academic on research on advertising leadership is almost non-existent. So we thought we'd change things. We started where the research was with Globe and the demonstrated link between leadership and organisational success. Its multi-country analysis showed people wanted leaders to be trustworthy, inspirational, forward-looking, goal-oriented and decisive. But its findings have never been internationally tested in advertising leadership. So we conducted 2 studies. The first was a survey of 255 agency staff across the US, UK and Australia. And we are so grateful for their time, their insights and their support of academic research. On top of that, we had interviews with 40 of the top agency leaders across the 3 countries. To have that kind of pool of people within Australia and internationally was a credit to the advertising industry. We found that integrity was the top leadership attribute across all 3 countries. Being visionary, inspirational, team-oriented and decisive were also seen as being highly desirable. And the leader no one wanted to have was malevolent, non-participative and conflict-inducing. Interestingly, there was nothing statistically significant between the different countries, but there were some differences. Being visionary ranked higher in the US and Australia. Being inspirational ranked higher in the UK and Australia. And being decisive ranked in the top 3 in the US, but not in the other regions. So then we looked at leadership styles. Collaborative and performance-oriented styles were rated most effective, followed by humane, independent, charismatic, autonomous, and dictatorial. Now, these are similar, but not identical to those based on the Globe data. So, for example, collaborative was 9th on Globe's list, but it was the top of our list. Again, there were no statistically significant differences by country, agency size, or agency type. The whole collaboration aspect is a really big change in the business. You have to have leaders that will embrace collaboration and make that happen. I think that's probably the biggest skill that a leader needs. I think being able to demonstrate that change is just business as usual. That's a new paradigm, an important part of leadership. Interestingly, one new factor that emerged in our study was the lowest rated style, which we called dictatorial. And even more interestingly, Australian advertising employees were significantly more tolerant of this dictatorial style than those in the US. Something else we found that was different to the Globe results was the importance of soft skills. None of the 21 Globe leadership attributes specifically encompass soft skills. As one very astute APAC CEO, who shall remain nameless, excuse me, Lee, said, the core things within leadership are still the human element. How you interact, how you inspire, how you admit vulnerability. jump ahead of myself. There were also some differences by age, agency experience, and agency level. Practitioners aged over 40 or those who had more than 20 years advertising experience considered performance-orientated leadership more effective than their younger counterparts, while those entry-level employees preferred charismatic leaders. So to summarise, and there's a lot more in our paper, agency leaders saw themselves as facilitators and not as people with all the answers. They saw their role as one that encouraged shared responsibility across agencies, cross-functional teams. They believed it important to convey to staff a sense of purpose, a sense of knowing where the company was going, and the role that each of them played in helping the agency keep up with the challenges of tomorrow and, I suspect, also today. So advertising leaders not only think different, they lead different too. To tell you more about Australian leadership, I'm going to hand it over to Louise Kelly. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks, Gail. Well, to lead different. Sometimes when we do research, the most interesting findings don't always make it to academic journals. And Gail and I found that when we were doing the interviews with our advertising leaders, the leaders all showed such a genuine and positive enthusiasm around this research. They gave their time generously, and the interviews often went way, way over time. And one participant likened it to having a therapy session. Can I just check that I'm sharing, aren't I? Oh, I got my slides on.
Yeah.
It seems that our leaders were very eager to talk about leadership. This enthusiasm to learn more about leadership in advertising and how it's perceived really reinforces the value behind this research. So Gail has provided a great overview of the findings from the paper, and we thought it would be useful to highlight some themes from the Australian interviews, to give some insights into how Australian leaders view leadership and what they consider makes a good leader. We found that consistency seemed to be a really important theme, that it wasn't about big speeches or grand gestures, but it was the smaller, more genuine, authentic little things that were done each day that was really important. So if we looked at characteristics of a good leader, Australian leaders believe that to lead, they need to have the ability to listen, to be visible, to be authentic, and not always have to provide the answers. They accept that they might need to be tough and make tough decisions when necessary and take the lead. And they also feel a responsibility to make the world a better place. We heard time and time again in the interviews that leaders really need to listen to their people. They need to know what's going on in their workplace and their home life and be able to respond in a manner that's really supportive. It was important for leaders to be seen, to be part of conversations, to be visible, to know what's going on, to be involved. Some leaders worked in an open plan environment just to be part of the agency vibe, and coffee always seemed to be an important part of the bonding process. Most leaders felt that it was important to be able to walk the walk. What we found was that many Australian leaders began their careers as copywriters and media planners or account managers. And it was this experience that really fostered their passion for advertising. And we heard that quite a few leaders, that they really relished the opportunity to get stuck into a campaign and work with their team on strategies, and that was a really important experience to get back to the roots of where they started out. Leaders also realised that, that they didn't always have to have all the answers, and to work with their team also showed an opportunity to be vulnerable, to not always know the answers, regardless of their extensive experience. We heard that leaders feel that they can set the direction, but they also know at times that they may need to step back and allow their team to follow up or to come up with the answers. Leaders understand that they can't be popular all the time, and that sometimes to lead, you need to make really, really difficult decisions. And we saw this time and time again last year during COVID, when leaders were really asked to make really tough decisions and make those decisions early. And advertising leaders also felt a real ethical responsibility to their staff and to society in general, with many acknowledging the importance to give back to society and make the world a better place through supporting charities and pro bono work. And this was something that was really important to the leaders. When asked what challenges leaders faced, one of the key themes was that there was a lot of pressure associated with keeping up with the constant change in the industry, understanding the new platforms, the different ways of communicating, and just keeping up to date and doing all the reading that is required of that, and the training around it was a big challenge. Working with younger staff also meant that communication styles were different between their staff and the leaders. And leaders often said to us that they need to encourage their younger staff to get on the phone or to go and visit clients in person rather than relying on emails or texting. So they had to work with their staff to work on their soft skills. And that was something that our study showed as being central to good leadership, was really strong soft skills. Retaining talented staff was also a big challenge, with the churn rates, particularly pre-COVID, being very high. And quite often we were hearing of the frustration and expense in training young grads and then having them move to another agency, which was very disappointing. Managing culture, making sure that the young people that you hire are a good cultural fit with the organisation, and this is reflected as part of as an important element in the hiring process. Educating clients was a challenge, keeping clients informed with new technologies and working with them in the creative and the planning process, and the importance of building relationships with clients and partnerships. One interesting finding was that given the size of Australia and the nature of the industry, even the big ad agencies are considered to be small business, with the limitations and challenges that go with small business. So who's training the leaders? Many leaders felt that there was a perception of limited leadership training available, especially at the senior level. New grads are well supported within the advertising industry, and with many training opportunities and organisations like NGen. Yet for senior managers, there needed to be more support. Sorry. Some larger agencies offered university-based training, but this was something that was not always available to smaller agencies. Many leaders found that because they were originally very, very good at their job, either in creative or media or strategy, they were then promoted to leadership and management roles, which meant that they ended up not actually doing the work that they loved and were really good at. And this caused concern for them and made them question their abilities as a manager or a leader. So the next big thing, when we asked them what leaders thought was the next big thing for advertising, technology and automation was often discussed, and how will agencies respond with a lot of their activities becoming automated? What impact will that have on the agency structure, in particular media agencies? Many felt that it was an unsustainable commercial model. The more profitable areas of advertising are generally the more traditional advertising outputs, and often this part of advertising is on the decline. So the areas for high growth are often the areas that have a lower margin, and this impacts ad agencies' ability to make profit. The value in relationship, not procurement. Agencies operate on a relationship basis with their clients, and if there's a shift towards advertising being part of the procurement process, then this will obviously have an impact on the agency model. And finally, what we perceive to be an advertising agency continues to evolve and change. So what we know and understand as an ad agency is changing. We've got now media agencies, digital agencies, creative content creators, search, analytics, boutique agencies and consultancies all in the mix. They're all providing a service and in competition with each other, which in turn makes leaders need to lead different. So I will leave you with a quote from our next speaker, Lee Terry, where Lee suggests that when it all boils down, the definition of what an agency is can or perhaps should change. But in the end, advertising is really all about helping clients navigate a complex world. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce, Mr. Lee Terry, Asia Pacific CEO of IPG Media Brands, to provide us with an industry perspective of how to lead different. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Louise and Gail. And clearly, you must have caught me on a day where I was inspired, because I think getting quoted twice by you two in quick succession, I feel quite humbled. Thank you for inviting me to, as ever, take part at a QUT event. I love the fact that you guys focus, you understand our business, and you focus on areas that aren't necessarily covered as much as other areas within the communication spectrum, and this absolutely being one. I think everybody will be pleased I don't have any PowerPoint slides, which is most unlike me, so it's a bit more freewheeling. But I've looked to break down some thoughts and observations on the research in general, but then specifically through personal experience and observations through COVID, because I think as ever, when you're tested under pressure, that can sometimes change leadership styles and priorities. And I think first and foremost, and I think you guys have captured it, and it's no surprise to me because you have either worked in the industry or you're so close to it, and I know that we chat a lot that it comes through, but I don't think any successful agency leader that I've ever met thinks of it as a job. It's not, you don't turn up and check in and then leave. It's definitely not a 9-to-5 job, not that they exist anymore. But I've always thought of it as very much it's a vocation. I think in terms of the lessons in leadership and from the research, I don't think it altogether surprises me, and almost irrespective of industry or even level of leadership. I think we all want to work for good bosses as opposed to bad bosses. We want to be treated fairly. We want to be treated well. And I think particularly in a creative industry, and I don't just simply mean advertising, I mean advertising, media, the marketing fraternity, integrity, vision and inspiration is something that in such a heavily creative and people-focused business we have to be. And certainly for some of the best bosses I've worked for, they've absolutely had all three of those attributes in spades. But I think we as commercial entities, when we're hired to do a job, it's against a particular criteria, and that's what we get paid for. We want people to have fun and be inspired whilst they're there, but performance is clearly critical. And therefore, I think one of the things that comes through in terms of being performance orientated, in order to do that, clarity of expectation and the measurement of it is essential. It's essential in any business, but I think within the parameters of people within advertising and media agencies, you have to have that. So feels a lifetime ago when I used to run the Dell media business across Australia and New Zealand. The client literally started pretty much every meeting with, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. And I think having that rigor around a measurement and a management criteria go hand in glove. It came up more in the Australia research than the international markets, but Louise talked to it, that consistency is something that is important, and certainly more so which felt here in Australia. In advertising, there's lots of things that get said a lot that become buzzwords and stereotypes, but change is a constant. There'll never be this little amount of change again, as the pace of change, particularly as a result of technology, keeps changing. But I do think in life, at all times, but especially when under stress, and let's be under no illusion, the last 12 to 15 months have been stressful for everybody. But within our industry, whether it's at a business level, society, and a personal level, it can be quite confronting. So I think that consistency of leader tested everybody last year. But when you go to your leader and you don't know how they're going to react, are they going to be sad, are they going to be angry, are they going to shout? Yes, we're all human beings, we're not robots. But when you're managing people, and I've always thought we are a people business, and I'll touch on that in a second. You have to maintain your humanity and be yourself, but on top of that, you have to be consistent. Even if you are pedaling like an absolute mad thing under the water, you need to look like a swan atop it. It's much harder to do than simply say, and I know for an absolute fact I'm far from perfect at it, but it's one thing I find myself resorting back to and trying to be as a center of gravity when I find myself getting frustrated or stressed. And that was multiple times through the last 18 months. It got touched on in terms of the, from a people focused perspective and the collaboration that is required. I think that has evolved over the 20 plus years I've been in the business, because the diversity of skill sets have changed within all agencies, particularly media agencies, as digital diversification has occurred. Therefore, you have to be flexible in your ability to deal with multiple people from multiple backgrounds, and diversity is an absolute, it's an absolute gift. But again, there's a lot of academic work around that it leads to better outcomes, but in getting to those outcomes, it can actually create more awkwardness because of the depth of conversation that those diverse backgrounds and peoples can bring. So the different types of leadership training, if you like, and it is few and far between. I've been lucky enough to be a recipient in my places of work, and certainly one of them was over in Boston, and was lucky enough to be taught by Jim Heskett, particularly around service profit chain. And again, I think from a leadership perspective, I've always been of the view that employee engagement in agencies leads to client engagement, that then leads to shareholder engagement. But it's interesting when I boil it down to happy people do happy work, not just because it sounds like the right thing to say, but because it makes absolute business sense. Louise touched on the fact that there's finding talent, keeping talent, the competitive nature of the industry to, you train people up and then they get poached for more money. The reason why you lose business or get less client satisfaction scores primarily is as a result of staff churn, the loss of IP, and in such a people-focused and relationship business, clients do get disgruntled and then potentially pitch their business if the people who have become the trusted advisors on their business are suddenly moving and getting replaced, and then you're almost back at square one. I often talk about the concept internally of work family, and I said it's not a 9-to-5 job. And while work is absolutely a subset of life and not the other way around, although to be fair, on occasion it can be, and I'd be lying if I said that for periods of my life in my 20s and 30s, if I said that my career and job didn't pretty much take over everything else, I'd be lying. So I think the age dynamic in the research is a really interesting one, and perhaps as we get older and wiser, perhaps smarter, not harder. Doesn't mean that you're any less passionate, but definitely age does give you a greater sense of balance. But I think one thing, it doesn't necessarily come through this research because it wasn't specifically looking to focus on it, but I am very, very glad that in an industry that that does live and breathe itself, that work-life balance is getting the attention, and particularly mental health balance and building resilience is getting the formal attention that it never did, but very much deserved. I think from a staff perspective at a wider level, and we've done, or sorry, I've done in my career, different pieces of work around this in terms of the what makes a great place to work for staff, and that being reflected in the business performance. And it fundamentally is about the trust between management and staff. There's a place called the Great Places to Work Institute that look at the best companies to work at, certainly here in Australia and New Zealand. And I think that building that trust, it's hard to build, it takes time, but it's really easy to destroy really quickly. And I think the creation of it and the destruction of it all come down to authenticity and honesty within the business. It doesn't mean, as Louise said, all conversations have to be happy. It's not about making everybody happy and doing everything that everybody wants. There does need to be hard calls. But fundamentally, feedback that comes from the communications with staff, if you listen to it, feedback's an absolute gift. Responding to it so people recognize that they've been heard, even if when you're responding to it, you're not absolutely having to do everything that is requested, whether it's because it's it's unaffordable, whether it's unworkable, whatever it is, so long as the level of communication with staff on their feedback is acknowledged and you respond to it, I think it is critical. Whilst the research focuses on the US, UK and Australia, who do in many respects, whilst different countries, and we always say share, separated by a common language, we do share many cultural commonalities and histories. And as somebody from the UK who's now been in Australia for 15 years, but speaking with my global bosses in New York at least once daily, it's quite interesting that the commonalities resonate. But with my APAC hat on, and again, perhaps this is a thought to the future, different cultures and behavioral styles across the region mean that this area of research could be interesting with further data sets. The hierarchy, the balance or not of gender through the different levels of leadership, as well as client demands and clients' attitudes to leadership, I think all play out slightly differently across markets like Japan, India, Thailand, Malaysia. So whilst diversity is one aspect, I think crucially, we talk very much to the importance of inclusivity being an essential component of that, which again, collaboration, creation of shared equity in the direction of the business, as opposed to simple command and control structures that may be in certain cultures. Just very quickly, because I know people will want to get to their tea and their toast, I did want to talk just about the COVID experience. As certainly Gail and Louise know, I studied history. I still think of myself somewhat as a historian and look to the past experiences, either personally, based on my experience, or the dark and distant past for guidance. And I think whilst it's not a new concept, and I think it goes back to the mid-80s and Bennis and Nannis talking about it from an academic perspective, the concept of VUCA, which have been very much adopted by military thinking around volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity in leadership. When I first came across that concept, it absolutely, it's an agency by another name, because certainly that volatility and the complexity and continuing ambiguity of how we deliver in an increasingly complex advertising ecosystem very much spoke to me. But I also think through the lens of COVID, the pandemic that we're still going through, it is and was very much a war. And I think looking at when something is on a war footing, leadership lessons and essential actions that need to take place of calming people, setting out a clear direction, even when you don't really have one, and a vision that it will get better, I think are absolutely essential. And as I look back on the actions that I certainly had to take They were some of the things that we look to do importantly as COVID hit in March. I mean, I can still painfully remember a former boss who I loved to bits, and he was great in so many ways. But he stood up in a staff meeting in 2001 when the dot-com crash happened, and said that the jobs that had just been lost, that won't happen again. And he said that, and then he had to stand up and say it 3 more times over the coming months. And I think I know he did. He lost a lot of personal credibility with the team as a result of making promises that he then couldn't fulfill on, and actually ended up personally having triple stomach ulcer as a result of the stress, which again, I think, you know, there's people talk about the loneliness of leadership. There is a lot of stress with it, and acting as a swan, you need to try and look to yourself to look after yourself as well. That said, when you can't provide absolute certainty in an uncertain world, where you can, and you can provide clarity to calm and soothe people, I think you should. And our global CEO sent an global all-staff email saying nobody had to return to the office throughout 2021 if they felt unsafe. And he did that at the start of December in 2020. I think in a world of lockdowns and different case levels by market, it created a surety in everybody's mind as a member of staff. It also showed the true dynamic of the company trying to look after its people. It was phenomenally well received. So where you can provide clarity with certainty, do so. The big plan, as I set it out, even with the lack of visibility, we needed a plan. Our staff expect us to have a plan. Our shareholders certainly do. And it's one that you can cling to and constantly refer back to. So confident uncertainty was the mantra that I set out as to how we were going to get through 2020. And I think with that, a realization and acceptance and a permission that that plan can change 26 times over 6 months, that's okay. And I think allowing team members to have that realization was pretty critical. Just on the personal side of leadership, the other part of me that has influenced my leadership style through COVID is running. And I used to be a good runner back in the day on track and cross country and the occasional marathon, but did say to the team in an email about this time last year that getting through 2020 and getting through COVID it's a marathon, not a sprint. And for any runners listening in, you'll know that even in a long distance race, you can still belt up a hill for 400 meters that helps you get through that tricky part of a run. And we very much saw a 6-week period as like getting up that hill, and that then set the plan and determine the success over the next 6 months. And trying to manage that uncertainty and freneticism, I think was critical. But as a pacemaker, you don't have to always be at the front. And it came through the research again of sharing the burden of leadership is critical. It also, as others get momentum from each other when they see difficult tasks being made easier, perceived through seeing the progress of others. Final observation, we're on a Zoom call this morning. I think the geographical dislocation, work from home, return to office, new normal, all of those things that have had a lot of time and attention and will remain to have that, and it will be different for different businesses. I think our new behaviors in terms of tech have completely transformed the way in which as agency leaders we need to maintain our communication, but also how we look to build cultures from a distance. And I think the ongoing challenge of leadership for advertising, and again, Gail, potentially a thought piece for another day of building cultures from a distance. How do we do that within the business? But I'll leave it there and just say thank you QUT, and thank you Louise and Gail specifically for doing something for our industry, and hopefully this gets more shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. So these are the results, and going back to that Think Different ad, You can quote them, you can disagree with them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them. So now it's over to you. If you've got any questions, as Edwina had directed you before, please put them in the chat or just turn off your mic and let us know.
Well, raise your hand and I can unmute you as well. I can allow you to talk.
I'll just jump in, Lee. Thank you so much for that presentation. The bit I've been trying to write notes is when you can't provide certainty, provide clarity. That is just fabulous. That sounds like a headline. Has that always been your way of leading and managing people, or is that something that really came to the surface last year?
Again, I think it's something you know is the right thing to do. Do you do it consistently? You try to, but I can't honestly say that I always do. But I do think the warlike footing that COVID put within businesses with such an absolute lack of visibility. I mean, literally, as it was happening, and we saw cases, and then wearing masks on planes, and then almost businesses going into lockdown. The reality of clients don't have any greater visibility than nobody had any greater visibility than anybody else. So it's it very much felt like you, as leaders, you have to say something. It is an absolute expectation, and rightly so, of staff, that they look to you as leaders. And I think it came through the research where it's about the decisiveness that some look to. Some are quite comfortable with more of that command and control. So staff being more comfortable with command and control of their leaders. And I think when people are scared, as we all were last year, having that greater clarity and decisiveness, people will default to people making decisions. But that was certainly heightened last year compared to a normal year.
Well, I don't know if we've got any questions. I've asked on the chat room. Oh no, we've got one person has put their hand up. Padmini.
Yes,
Hi.
Hello,
Oh, Padmini.
Hi. Just want to say hello and how much I enjoyed the presentation. It's 6:15 in the US right now. And I'm so thankful to Gail and Louise for working on this project with me. The remarks that Lee made were extremely interesting because you've actually pointed us in the direction our project's going to go next. We're actually investigating agency culture in our next set of research questions. And we're looking at it from the perspective of how the climate of agencies has changed. And we're also going to be focusing on training and what exactly is leadership training. So thank you for echoing the fact that the research that we're doing is really valuable and has industry-wide applications. And finally, the point about culture that you raised. Yes, this is more, the three countries that we picked were part of one cultural cluster. And there is a lot to learn from how other cultures and advertising agencies, other cultures also operate. So you're pretty much going that route as well. And we do have data from India, my native country of origin. And we're going to be using that also to analyze that and do some compare and contrast. But we have a great research team, and thank you to all the participants for taking part in this research and giving their valuable time and insights to help us decipher some of the things that are happening in our industry.
Thank you, Padmini. Thank you for your leadership in all of our research projects. Much appreciated. And we're looking forward to getting back to the US and actually seeing you face to face at some stage in the hopefully not too distant future.
I'm sorry, Edwin. I was going to say there's a point that Louise made, and Padmini's just reminded me of it, that doesn't matter how much experience you have in the industry, nobody's ever got all the answers. And I think leaders sometimes take the burden of leadership as thinking that they must have the answers when people ask them the questions. And I think that is horribly, it's putting a burden of pressure on yourself, let alone on how you run a business. And I think because the industry has changed so much, even in the 25 years I've been in it, that acceptance and recognition that you don't have all the answers, but equally that your ability to change and adapt sometimes means that you're not going to get it right first time every time. It's a bit like riding a bike. Very rare that you have a kid who can just jump on a bike and ride and fall off a few times. And I think recognition of, and it's part of that authenticity of leadership, of saying that I recognize that the business or the world is changing. I want to change and learn, and will you help support me in that endeavor? Is actually quite liberating, and you end up getting better answers and better support because it becomes a culture of nurturing and learning. So industry leaders or agency leaders beyond the university style programs rarely get time and attention, because most of the budgets go to training up the newbies, or somebody's now been promoted to a manager, let's give them manager training. It's yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I've got some questions on the chat line. Tiba, would you like to unmute yourself and talk about ask your cultural question, or do you think that was answered in the last little bit? I'm just trying to work through. Okay. So, awesome.
Hello.
Hi.
Good morning, all. I would like to thank you for a very interesting presentation. But I would like to ask you regarding the culture advertising, how the culture affect by the advertising, because as you can see, in Asia Pacific, there is different culture, and how they are getting the advertising in different way, how we can do so they can understand the advertising and how that affect for example, the economic, the political way, or extra.
Yep, I think that's a good question. And our research, specifically when we were looking at Australia, the US and UK, they were part of what Globe calls an Anglo cluster. So we kind of looked deep and narrow in this first paper. But as Padmini said, we'd like to expand that and look across other cultures, but we haven't got there yet.
All right, thank you so much for that.
It must be a challenge, Lee, if your organisation you're covering off in the Asia Pacific area, because there is so many different cultures underneath that umbrella.
Yeah.
Do you find your leadership style changes depending on the culture of the areas that you're leading?
Yeah, I mean, certainly over the last, since I took on the APAC role, again, my Irish grandmother always said, you got two ears, one mouth, listen twice as much as you talk. You definitely have to do that, because the learning experience of, I've said there's no United States of Europe, irrespective of what the EU think. There's definitely not a United States of Asia. And I think even countries that share borders have got rich cultures, behaviors, even where they share borders that are very different. And the last thing, I want to have consistency within our approach to business, so that when we're working with multinational global clients, we're able to deliver on our promises. But the last thing I want to do is homogenize our cultures, because that's what makes markets special. And I mean, just internally, when I talk about inclusivity as opposed to just diversity of talent, that we've done a lot of internal research about what inclusivity means in each of our markets, and it does come through that culturally, some markets would expect, what the boss says, everybody does it. There's no debate. There's no feedback loops. Yeah, it's so we're very mindful of the cultural nuances in internally, as well as how that plays out with consumers when we're working with clients on their plans.
We've just got time for one more question, because we've still got lots of people staying around, so that's awesome. Liam, I'll put it over to you.
Thank you so much. Look, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Lee, on I think what we've seen is a really strong shift in staff expectations through kind of this COVID period. And I think, you know, for a lot of businesses, you know, in advertising that may not have been more progressive, things like work from home and flexibility and lifestyle balance wasn't something that we actively considered as leaders for our teams. But we found our team expectations of us as leaders and, you know, of us as agencies has really shifted. And the teams are seeking a lot more flexibility and lifestyle over remuneration as compensation, and often, you know, coming to the table. You know, do you feel like you're seeing this trend as well? And you know, as a leader within your organization, how do you feel you can maximize both that shifting kind of team expectation around how they want to work and how to continue to drive, you know, strong outcomes out of that? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that kind of COVID shift, and whether you feel it's happened and how you feel the best responses that you've seen.
Yeah, oh look, it's a brilliant question. It's has it happened? Yes. Is it continuing to happen? Absolutely, because it will evolve. It's a bit like a pendulum swing. With the extremity of last year, with lockdowns and literally, I think over the course of about 4 weeks, we ended up having to, across 13 markets, get 3,000 people who are used to going into the office every day to work from home, which, you know, in some of our markets, that was massive challenges, like getting 300 computers to people's homes because they don't have internet access, and, you know, there was logistical challenges. I'm a massive fan of flexibility, and I said earlier that work is a subset of life, not the other way around. So long as the work gets done to the level that it needs to, and this will be a changing dynamic as clients may or may not go back to the offices, because agencies are generally a reflection and a mirror of, you know, the casting that's required in order to deliver client services. But I think we have shattered the illusion that you need to all be going into a metro CBD office Mondays to Fridays, 8:30 to 6. You know, we've shattered that. So I think, and we're working through this within IPG, that a hybrid model, and I would hate it if we suddenly all went back to the office and stopped doing this. But I remember a conversation with Soltra here, who was running Telstra back in 05, 06, about the importance of video calling. It took a pandemic for us to actually start doing this. But I think now that we've created the behavioural shift, we'll end up having somewhere between what it is now and what it was. And the word I use most internally is balance. And my balance will be different to your balance. And there'll be 1,000 different conversations as to how to get that balance. But as a business and as a leader, I'm committed to trying to accommodate people's flexibilities as much as possible. But it is a privilege, not a right. And I think if it changes and we need to go back into offices for whatever reason, it's going to be an interesting one. But yeah, trying to build on the flexibilities that we've had now is absolutely what we're doing.
Gail or Lou, do you want to add anything to that question of Liam's?
We also did some research about COVID. We kind of did a follow-up, and very much as Lee said, it was kind of like the personal skills came in. Being a mother, I think someone described that to the whole agency, and looking after people as well as looking after work, which is an interesting sort of balance there. But yeah, hopefully we'll have a paper out on that at some time in the future, Louise.
We've got to get cracking on that now.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure at all. But it was interesting for us looking at agencies you know, a lot of the agencies that are smaller are all back working in the office, whereas agencies that are sort of run by a New York office aren't. And it's just sort of that lack of flexibility. I was talking to one of our media people the other day, and he said, "Oh no, we're not in because we're run by head office." And I found that interesting. Do you see that progressing, Lee?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, people. Again, we're talking about, you know, human beings, and we're all individuals and have got slightly different attitudes to it. But I mentioned earlier, Daryl, my global CEO, of trying to give that surety of not having to come into the office, because, you know, there'll be lockdowns, there'll be case spikes and all that. I mean, within Australia, we currently have 30% of staff going in on a weekly basis. So again, this week you'll be in, next week you'll be in. So, you know, up to 60% of staff are actually going into the office. But we continually do staff surveys, and partly around team dynamic, mental health. Some people really want to be back in the office, and we're looking to accommodate that. Others are quite happily never setting foot in the office again, and it's trying to put people on the bell curve and accommodate everybody and get the work done. I mean, I saw Scott's put an interesting question into the chat about geographical relocation, and you know, somebody doing a regional job out of Sydney because they've relocated and now looking at moving to Brisbane. The tax jurisdiction implications of that, what salaries you pay people if it's doing work in one territory versus, I mean, there's a lot of global logistic challenges that we're all business going through. We certainly are. Tax advisors are licking their chops at the concept of this, because it is and whether it's in contravention of client contractors to whether you say that staff have to be in a certain country. Yeah, there's a lot of logistics with this change. It's all happening in a very, very concentrated time period.
Do you think the focus on lifestyle and flexibility will help or will power a shift away from this kind of vocational approach to advertising, where it is so much more than a job? Or will that become more transactional? Will we see more of a gig economy drive to the way that we provide work for clients?
I certainly hope so. I think that starts to help the talent challenge that Louise touched on. I think the Media Federation, it was either last year or the year before's data, which is probably more relevant, said that there was 6% of jobs open at any one moment in time because there's not enough people coming into the industry. I think we lose a lot of brilliant talent, particularly mothers who don't have the flexibility to go back. And I think with work from home, with, you know, if you can break down certain jobs so it is more not all in or nothing, that I'm really hopeful that opens up, you know, talented people in Toowoomba, as opposed to, you know, it should open up an untapped talent pool, whether it's part of the gig economy, whether it's people who want to stay in the industry but have felt that the flexibility has never been there to allow them that and have that balance. So yeah, I'm a bit glass half full on it, that it's going to open up some brilliant talent that we've not seen before.
I think we'll leave it there. What a fantastic morning, and what a great way to kick off our advertising, marketing and public relations business breakfasts. For those of you who are still online, our next breakfast will be in July, so stay tuned and look out for those emails. But can I please thank Gail, Louise and Lee. What an amazing presentation. And obviously you've got lots of chat and more chat coming through as well. So thank you so much, and thank you to our participants who joined in for the webinar, and hope you've really got a lot out of it. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have lovely days.
See you later.
Thanks, guys.